Do you want to know how to paint with confidence and break through those watercolour nerves? In this step-by-step painting tutorial, I'll show you how to paint this tropical bird using my Learn to Paint As You Go approach. So let's get painting. I've done a really simple outline of the toucan here, and we have a line drawing and a reference photograph accompanying this tutorial, and I'll tell you how you can access them a little bit later on. All the materials that I'll be using I will link in the description box underneath this video, and use whatever colours and equipment that you have. This is the colour chart that I use to match up my colours, and if you'd like to make one, I'll link it on the top of your screen right now. It just makes the colour selection a whole lot easier. So let's begin by mixing up our first washes, and I'm using 3 different colours here. We have Indigo. This is by Mungyo, and I find it's more of a kind of Payne's grey type colour, and I'm adding to this a little bit of vandyke brown. We are using just a few colours for this tutorial, and like I said, I'll link them all in the description box underneath this video. Now, to begin with, I'm working wet and wet using my number 2 size spotter. Spotter brushes are the same as any other brush, but they have a smaller bristle, which means that it's easier to apply the paint. We're working wet in wet, which simply means that we're adding water to the paper and we'll apply the paint exactly where the water has been applied. Really, really simple, and it just makes the application of the first washes a lot easier. So make sure that you stay within that pencil line, and you can see the water glistening here on the paper where I've applied it. Once I'm happy that the water is in the correct place, you can see me dropping in the pigment like this. Notice how it splurges into the water, giving it a really soft edge. And I'm applying this paint all over the back of the bird, but I'm sort of leaving a lighter area where you saw on the photograph there. It's a little bit lighter on the top. So just let that paint settle into the paper and find its way naturally where that lighter area is. It really is a simple process. Now, I will say, if you are new to watercolour painting, I recommend that you watch this video all the way through. I know that watercolour has a little bit of a bad press for being a difficult medium to work with, and sometimes if you're new to painting, it can look wrong halfway through, but believe me, it's all part of the process, and if you just watch this video all the way through, you'll notice and you'll be able to see how the process unfolds and how it all comes together in the end. You can see me here using the tip of my brush, just gently pushing that paint into the areas where I want it to go. Just working around that little highlight like this and just having a really light glaze where we want to eventually build up the colours. With watercolour, we work from light to dark, so we apply the watercolour in layers, making sure that each layer is dry before we apply the next. You'll notice that I've got the small puddles of paint on my palette. This is, it just makes the application of the water a lot easier. If I'd been dipping my brush into the jar, I would probably have too much water on my brush and it would just go everywhere. It just makes it a little bit easier. So we have a pro tip there for you. The paper that I'm using today is a cold press paper, which means it has texture. Now, use whatever paper that you have, but I do like cold press paper because I find that it just makes the application, certainly the way I paint, a whole lot easier. This set is from Mungyo, but use whatever colours that you have within your own kit. But I will say that if you are using Mungyo paints, the indigo that I'm using is very similar to Payne's grey. It's quite a sort of dark indigo, and I wouldn't really call it indigo, but you want something like a Payne's grey type colour for the base of this toucan. I've added a little bit of vandyke brown to the bottom just to give it a little bit more of that dimension without it looking flat. Once again, just using the tip of my brush to push it into that pencil line. Because we're working wet on wet, it's really easy to move the paint around. And I'm just using a weaker solution of the same mix, wet on dry, which means I'm applying it straight onto the paper. You can see how just by using the tip of my brush I can push that paint into the smaller areas. The reason I'm working wet and dry is because the area is smaller, and if I were to work wet and wet it may be a little bit difficult to control. I'm using the paint in a lighter consistency here. It's paler in colour, having a lot more water added because we want to build those colours up a bit later and keep some of the lighter areas. It will all make sense in a minute. So I'm just adding a little bit of a dot here where the iris of the toucan's eye is, and we'll let all of this settle down before we start to apply the other colours. So now that everything's dry, I've cleaned down my palette and we can start to work on the body of the bird. I'm mixing a puddle of scarlet, two separate puddles here, one being slightly thicker than the other, having less water. And we have scarlet with a little bit of yellow orange. I think the yellow orange with Mungyo is very similar to Indian yellow, and I'm adding burnt umber to the top puddle here. And we have yellow orange on the bottom. And a smidgen of scarlet. So we wanted to have a sort of yellowy orangey tone. So I'm applying the orange colour directly around the area around the toucan's eye like this, again wet on dry, just applying it straight onto the paper because once again it's a smaller area. Now at the very start of this video I mentioned that we have a line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial, and you can find them over on our Facebook group, which I will link in the description box underneath. And this toucan is a rather special tutorial this week because it's a competition winner whereby one of our group members won the competition to have their photograph made into a YouTube tutorial. So congratulations to you. I'll link you in the description underneath, and thank you for allowing us to use your lovely photograph to make into a tutorial. I hope I've done you proud. So once again, wet in wet and letting that yellow tone blend into the paper like this. Just let the paint do the work by dropping it in wet. You can see me patting my brush dry on the kitchen paper just to have a damp brush rather than a wet brush. If I were to use a wet brush to blend it in, it would just make the paint bloom. In other words, pushing that paint away from itself, causing it to have a funny shape. We don't want that, so just use a damp brush by patting your brush dry on some kitchen paper or something like that. I'm just adding a tiny bit of the yellow tone to the beak or the bill of the bird and just blending it in as before. I have a full tutorial on how I apply my paint and the different types of paper that I use, and I will link it in the description box underneath this video if you'd like to take a look at that after you finish watching this one. Now once again, working wet and wet to have that natural blur, I'm applying the top colour, which is scarlet with a little bit of burnt umber. This has a kind of browny orange tone, and I'm just letting that drop through into the existing washes like this. Now already, even with this first wash on, even with this first wash applied, you can see that the bird already has a bit of shape and form. But of course, we will need to build up our layers slowly as we work through. But it's really good to have a strong, solid template on which to build, which is what this is. So now that that initial wash has dried, you can see me adding a little bit more of the yellow orange tone along with the scarlet to the eye like this, building up the colour. If you are enjoying this video, do consider subscribing to my channel. I release brand new videos every Tuesday and they are usually full-length tutorials just like this. And also, if you like it, please give it a thumbs up. It's a way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and it really helps to support me. I'm adding a little bit of vandyke brown to the colour of the top because I did feel it was a little bit too orangey, and this toned it down a little bit. I mentioned our Facebook group a little earlier on, and I ought to say that all of the line drawings and reference photographs are over there, so do consider joining us. And we are a lovely community. Everyone is really friendly, and you can get some feedback and post your finished paintings from our tutorials over there, and get some feedback from me too if you want it. So do consider joining us. Using the tip of my brush, I'm just outlining a few of the little details here on the bit, and I'm just tapping my brush into the paper with a kind of stippling motion to create the illusion of feathers. Now that everything's dry, I'm just going to mix a little bit more Van Dyke brown into the top mixture here. So the top mixture is scarlet, umber and Van Dyke brown, and I'm also putting a tiny bit of indigo. I'm working wet and wet again on the bark of the tree here. Now I will mention that I'm not actually going strictly to the photograph for the tree. I wanted to simplify it and show you how easy it is to get a bark-like effect using a really simple application method. So that's what I'm doing here. Once again, working wet and wet, applying the water where I want to drop the paint in. And once I'm happy where I've dropped the water, I'm going to drop in the paint like this. Right up to the pencil line to begin with, and just leaving little gaps here and there so that the paint settles into the paper in the same way that it did when I applied it to the bird. But I'm just dipping in between the three colours that I've mixed on my palette, letting them blur into each other like this. Now remember, these are just our initial washes and we'll build on them later on. Just using the tip of the brush again to put the colours right up to the pencil line like this. Because it's wet on wet, this will be really easy to do. And I'll continue that on the other ones like this. So now that the bird is dry, we can start to really build up those colours. Wet and wet again, and I'm going to drop the colours on once that's settled in like this. This will be the second wash, and we can start to really create some tonal value and some depth of colour by doing it like this. Patting my brush dry and then using that dry brush to create some shape. You'll notice at the top of the bird that it's slightly lighter, so we want to work around that area. Just picking up the pigment and creating that shape as I work through. I'm using a number 0 size spotter here to just create the illusion of feathers by just doing that sort of stippling motion as I did before to create a little bit of texture. I'm working around the shape of the feathers here. From the photograph, you'll see that there's a definite shape of where the feathers are settling in. So we want to keep that shape in the painting just by creating that little sort of W shape that I've just done here. Now, at the moment, the colours are too strong. We'll need to blend them together a little bit more because we have too much of a contrast between the lighter and the darker tones. But don't worry, we can blend them all together a little bit later. We just need to get these shapes in place. Using the same mix and a number 2 size spotter, I'm painting over the initial wash on the top of the bird's bill like this, blending in with a damp brush. Remember that I said at the beginning when I applied the lighter colour that we need to retain some of the light colour on this area because it gives it some shape and some form. And by using a pattern motion with a damp brush, that's exactly what we've achieved here. Just using a stippling motion to create the illusion of feathers. And just enhancing the iris of the bird's eye like this and the area around the outside of it, once again by using a really gentle stippling motion to create that circular shape. And again, where the eye meets the feathers, just going around like this. So on the bottom section, the same thing, applying the darker tone to the base and then using the damp brush to blend it into the grey tone at the top. The grey tone is a highlight, so we want to retain that so it gives the illusion of the bird's beak having some dimension and it not being flat. So it's important that you keep that lighter area towards the top like this. Damp brush and then just blending it through. But you don't want to take the colour all the way over, you just want to keep that little bit of grey at the very top. Switching my attention to the tail feathers of the bird, using the mixes that I have on my palette, using a number 2, I think it's a number 2 or a number 0 size spotter, it doesn't really matter which, and just using both wet on wet and wet in dry techniques here to apply some more paint to make it a sort of stronger colour, giving it some tonal value and some depth of colour like this. Using the tip of my brush to push it to the outside of the pencil line like this and also creating a little bit of texture. Once again, for this area, I haven't gone true to the photograph. I just want to give the viewer the illusion that there's texture here, and they are tail feathers like this, by wiggling my brush into the dry paint and just making it look as if there's a little bit of some veining and some texture there. I hope that makes sense. So I'm just using the tip of my brush and pulling it down like this, so that when the viewer looks at the photograph, looks at the painting, it doesn't look flat. We want it to have some tonal variation and some tone and some form. At this point, I did feel, as I said a little bit earlier, that the painting was there was too much contrast and we need to blend them together. I'm using a number 6 size spotter to go over the entire thing, just using some plain water to merge the colours together. Now, it's really important at this stage, if you do this, that your washes are dry underneath. You have to do this once the paint is dry, using a very gentle brush stroke to merge the colours together. This is called plain water glazing, and I use it all the time to blend my colours together to make sure that they look evenly distributed like this. If you are enjoying this tutorial, we have a Patreon site where we do botanical painting tutorials starting at £3 a month or thereabouts. For the full tutorials, it's £7 a month. Do take a look. Patreon is a membership platform or subscription service with multiple tiers, each tier having a different reward, and it's a way of you supporting my channel if you want to. I will link it in the description box underneath this video. So turning our attention back to the toucan, once again I'm working wet in wet to apply the yellow tone to the belly of the bird. We now need to start building up the colours to make them look really strong where they're needed, although it's also as important to keep out of the lighter areas and retain those too. So I worked wet in wet here, applying a little bit of burnt umber as well as the initial wash of the yellow orange, just to make it a little bit stronger, and just pattern it into the existing wash. So I think with watercolour, particularly if you're new to painting, it can be something that I know many of you are quite nervous about using, and I was the same when I started painting. I'm self-taught, and I know that it can be a really daunting medium to work with. Although I have to say it really is all about practice and just getting to know the medium and how it reacts to the paper and the paint that you're using. We all have our own way of working, and I think it's important that you find a way that's true to yourself. Now you can see me adding a watered down version of the grey mix on my palette here to start to put some paint onto the claws or the feet of the bird. I'm not sure what you would call them. Let's call them the claws. So I'm just working with a tiny little brush here. This is a number 2 or number 0 size spotter, adding a tiny bit of the vandyke brown to the grey mix. And while I'm here, I've decided to add a little bit more texture around this area. So I added a tiny bit of vandyke brown to the top puddle, and this is a really watered down version. I wanted the colours to be really soft and subtle here. So in order to do that with watercolour, we just add water to lighten our paints. And I'm just dropping in a tiny bit of that thicker mix there, just to give a little bit of texture on the beak of the bird. Once again, blending in with my damp brush. And just adding a little bit of form here where there's a natural kind of shape within the beak of the bird. So now that everything's dry, I've cleaned on my palette and I'm turning my attention back to the tree. Same mixes as before, vandyke brown with burnt umber, and we also have the same mix with indigo. Going over the entire thing once again with water, we're going to be working wet in wet. Again, dropping those colours in one by one. As I said at the start, I'm not going to be going true to the photograph for the branches because I wanted to simplify it and show you how easy it is to get that kind of bark-like texture with not paying too much attention to the photograph, just making it super easy for you. So I'm doing exactly the same thing as I did for the first wash, going over it with water where I want to drop the paint. You'll notice that the paint on my palette this time is slightly thicker. This time we wanted to have a bit more colour, so we need to put less water with our mix so that we can drop it in and just have it gently merge in as before, but with a stronger colour. Be careful as you hit the beak of the bird. You don't want any water or any paint to go on that, just a really sharp edge is needed there. So where the paint has naturally settled, you can see me using a smaller brush now that the paint has partially dried, working around the areas where the paint has naturally dried. This gives the illusion of bark, and I've done the same thing on all the other branches like this. I'm using the tip of my brush to just add a little bit of detail here and there. Now at this point I would say it's semi-dry, so it just gives that a little bit of a blurred edge, but you could do it wet on dry as well. Just to go around any shapes that you see naturally forming. Using the tip of my brush just to sharpen up the outside edges of the branch. This is a really quick way of giving the illusion of texture. And just using a little stippling motion to create some more shapes. So once again, I've cleaned down my palette and I'm back to the bird. We have indigo on the top, indigo with a tiny bit of Van Dyke brown, and also the yellow tone on the bottom with a tiny bit of scarlet. This time I want to enhance the colours that we've put in place because I feel that they needed a little bit more depth of colour and form. So I'm using the brush and switching my attention to the feathers, creating that stippling motion once again to give the illusion of feathers and a little bit of texture. Just using the mixes on my palette to create those shapes that I need. And just adding some texture here using that sort of stippling pattern motion to create those feathers. Turning my attention back to the feet, or the claws of the bird I should say, using the number 0 size spotter to create some detailing, just following the photograph. I'm just drawing in the lines with my paint, as you can see here, and then once again I'm softening them through with a damp brush. I'm also using this opportunity to outline the outside of its claws so that it has a really sharp contrast between the claw and of course the branch of the tree where the bird is perched. So at this point it really is a matter of just continuing the process, looking at your photograph, trying to assess your tonal values, asking yourself whether that paint is dark enough or whether you needed to blend it through a little bit more with a damp brush. It's just a case of building things up until you're happy with the finished painting. Now I've still got a little way to go, but it is repeating what I've already done. I'm going to stop talking, play you some music so that you can watch the rest of the tutorial in peace.